February 26, 1815. The Mediterranean sun glinted across the calm waters as a small flotilla slipped away from the island of Elba. Aboard the lead vessel stood a figure whose very presence had once shaken the foundations of Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte. Less than a year ago, he had been forced to abdicate, exiled by the victorious Allies to this tiny island off the Italian coast. Now, he was returning to France, not with an army, but with barely 1,000 men, and with the ambition to reclaim an empire. The road to this moment was paved with humiliation and calculation. After his crushing defeat in the War of the Sixth Coalition, Napoleon had surrendered to terms that would have destroyed any ordinary man. The Treaty of Fontainebleau had exiled him with the title Emperor of Elba, a cruel mockery of his former power. Elba was a prison, albeit a gilded one, and the Allied powers believed Europe was safe from the man who had redrawn its borders time and again. But the continent was uneasy. The restored Bourbon monarchy under King Louis XVIII was deeply unpopular. France, drained by decades of war, found little solace in a monarch who represented the old aristocracy. The soldiers missed their emperor, the citizens grumbled about food shortages and taxes, and the generals, those who once led Europe's most formidable army, were out of favor or in retirement. Napoleon watched all this from afar, carefully gathering information through secret correspondence and loyal informants. He knew the Allies were distracted. Congress was underway in Vienna, where the leaders of Europe gathered to redraw the continent's political map. They celebrated the defeat of the Corsican ogre, believing him neutered on his Mediterranean island. They were wrong. On that February morning, Napoleon boarded the brig Inconstant and set sail with 600 members of his Imperial Guard and several ships loaded with arms and ammunition. His message was simple: I am still France. As the flotilla landed on the French coast near Golfe-Juan on March 1, 1815, Napoleon stepped onto his homeland once more, not as a fugitive, but as a returning sovereign. There were no bands, no parades, only the windswept hills of southern France and the uncertainty of how he would be received. His gamble was enormous. If the people and army rejected him, he would be branded a traitor and executed. But if they rallied... The first days were tense. Napoleon and his small column marched north through the countryside, avoiding major cities and government outposts. He issued proclamations, appealing not to the monarchy or aristocracy, but to the common people and the soldiers who once followed him to the ends of Europe. The eagles will fly again, he declared, invoking the imperial standards that once led victorious columns across battlefields from Austerlitz to Wagram. In Grenoble, the first great test came. A royalist regiment blocked his path. Napoleon strode forward alone, his coat unbuttoned to reveal the familiar silhouette of the man who had once been their emperor. He opened his arms and called out, "Soldiers, if there is one among you who would shoot his emperor, here I am." There was silence, then tears, then cheers. The soldiers joined him. The Bourbons had lost their grip on the army. With every village passed and every regiment turned, Napoleon's strength grew. Towns opened their gates, mayors bowed in allegiance. By the time he reached Lyon, the city erupted in celebration. The Bourbon garrison fled. In a matter of days, Napoleon's ragged band had transformed into a triumphant procession. He was no longer an exile. He was a force of history returned. In Paris, King Louis XVIII trembled. The royal court was paralyzed by indecision. Despite efforts to rally support, the king found little trust among his people or his army. On March 19th, he fled the capital. The next day, Napoleon entered Paris unopposed. A sea of tricolor flags filled the streets. Cannons roared in salute. The throne was his once again. And yet, he knew this was only the beginning. Though France embraced his return, the rest of Europe did not. The news of Napoleon's landing shattered the celebratory mood of the Congress of Vienna. The Allied monarchs were stunned, then furious. They issued a joint declaration labeling him an outlaw, a threat to world peace. Armies began to mobilize with astonishing speed. Prussia, Britain, Austria, and Russia, nations that had once bled under the weight of his wars, would bleed again to stop him. Napoleon moved swiftly. He reinstated key figures from his old regime, promised liberal reforms, and sought to unite the fractured nation under the banner of stability. But he knew that war was inevitable. He had not returned merely to govern, he had returned to fight. The stage was set. The emperor had returned. The crowned heads of Europe were closing in. Once more, the fate of the continent would be decided by cannon fire and the clash of empires. And at the center of it all stood Napoleon Bonaparte, once defeated, now risen, walking the road to destiny. That road led north, to Belgium, and to a quiet valley that would soon become the final crucible of a legend, Waterloo. The news of Napoleon's escape from Elba hit Europe like a thunderclap. Word traveled swiftly, first as rumor, then confirmed by dispatches and fleeing royalists. By the time Napoleon had marched into Paris in triumph on March 20, 1815, the crowned heads of Europe were already bracing for war. The man they had exiled, the figure they believed broken and buried, had returned with the roar of a lion. And Europe, exhausted though it was, would not allow the nightmare to begin anew. In Vienna, the Congress that had been redrawing Europe's post-war order was jolted into panic. Representatives from Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia had gathered to debate borders, kingships, and the fates of fallen empires. Now, their grand designs were threatened by the resurgence of the very man who had once trampled all those things beneath his boots. The Congress, designed to ensure lasting peace, had to confront its greatest test, a war it had hoped never to fight again. Napoleon's timing was shrewd. He knew the great powers were still scattered, not fully remobilized. Most had disbanded much of their armies after the 1814 victory. Supplies were limited. Troops had returned to farms and barracks. And the coalition, though victorious in unity, was always fragile in purpose. But nothing unites like a shared threat, and to the monarchies of Europe, Napoleon was nothing less than a specter of revolution, ambition, and war. On March 13th, even before Napoleon reached Paris, the Congress of Vienna issued the Declaration of Outlawry. It was not merely a condemnation, it was a call to arms. The statement read, "Napoleon Bonaparte has placed himself outside the protection of the law. By reappearing in France with projects of confusion and disorder, he has forfeited the sole guarantee which he had received." In simple terms, Napoleon was to be treated not as a ruler, but as a criminal, a rogue element to be destroyed. The urgency of the moment forged renewed cooperation. Austria, Russia, Prussia, and Britain, despite differences, pledged to mobilize massive armies to crush Napoleon before he could consolidate power. The Seventh Coalition was born. Each nation would bring its weight to bear. Great Britain, under the steady leadership of the Duke of Wellington, pledged over 30,000 troops. Its navy would blockade French ports and sever Napoleon's global reach. Prussia, still smarting from past defeats, would muster over 120,000 men under the aging but determined Field Marshal Blücher. Austria, despite internal fatigue, began raising 200,000 troops under Prince Schwarzenberg. Russia, though distant, promised to send nearly 150,000 troops westward, led by Tsar Alexander's generals. In total, nearly 1,000,000 soldiers were being prepared to descend upon France from all sides. It would be the largest mobilization Europe had seen since the fall of the Roman Empire. Back in France, Napoleon understood the danger. He had gambled everything on speed. He could not match the coalition in numbers, so he must strike before their armies fully united. His strength lay in the battlefield. His element was the offensive. And he had only months, perhaps weeks, before the full weight of Europe bore down upon him. Napoleon quickly began to rebuild. The tricolor flag once again flew over military barracks. His legendary marshals, Ney, Soult, and Davout, were recalled to service. Though many had sworn loyalty to the Bourbons, they now turned back to the man they once followed across continents. Some returned out of duty, others out of ambition, but all knew that the fate of France now rode on Napoleon's genius. He restructured the army, calling back veterans, conscripting fresh recruits, and re-establishing the Grand Army, though in truth, it was no longer grand. Equipment was in short supply. Morale varied. France was weary of war. Yet Napoleon moved with astonishing energy, personally reviewing troops, inspecting arms factories, and issuing decree after decree to consolidate support. Diplomatically, he attempted to reassure Europe that he sought only peace. He sent envoys declaring that France would not seek expansion, that he respected existing borders. But Europe would not be deceived. They had heard his promises before, and they had paid the price in blood. The British, especially, viewed Napoleon not just as a military threat but as a destabilizer of monarchic order. The Prussians hungered for revenge after years of humiliation. The Austrians feared renewed French influence in Italy and the Rhineland. And the Russians, far away, yet ever watchful, saw the Corsican's ambition as a threat to the continent's balance. Still, Napoleon had one hope: divide and conquer. If he could defeat the Allied forces piecemeal, perhaps shatter Wellington's army in Belgium before the Prussians arrived, he might force the coalition to the negotiating table. Victory, even limited, might restore France's place on more favorable terms. But to achieve that, he needed to act fast. Thus, he devised a bold plan. He would march north, into what is now Belgium, and strike at the British and Prussian armies before they could unite. The terrain was familiar. The roads near Brussels offered avenues for rapid movement. Intelligence suggested that the Allied armies were not fully concentrated. If he could move swiftly and seize the initiative, he might break their will to fight. The campaign would be short, brutal, and decisive. Time was his enemy. Delay meant doom. The Emperor began organizing his strike force, selecting 125,000 of his most loyal and battle-hardened soldiers. These men, many veterans of earlier campaigns, would carry the fate of the nation on their backs. By early June 1815, the armies of Europe were in motion. The Seventh Coalition converged upon France with fire in its eyes. But Napoleon, once again the master strategist, had already left Paris. He was headed north, toward the border, toward destiny, toward Waterloo. The drums of war echoed once again across Europe, and Napoleon Bonaparte, facing overwhelming odds, turned to the one weapon that had never failed him: speed. With nearly all of Europe marching against him, the Emperor understood he could not wait for their full force to arrive on French soil. He had to act before they could unite. A rapid, decisive blow would be his only chance. By early June 1815, Napoleon had completed the assembly of his newly rebuilt army. Though no longer the mighty Grande Army of years past, the 125,000 men under his command represented the core of France's military resilience. Veterans of Austerlitz, Wagram, and Dresden stood beside green conscripts hastily trained. His officers, Soult, Ney, Grouchy, and others, were experienced, though some bore scars of loyalty questioned and reputations tarnished. Regardless, all understood the gravity of what lay ahead. Napoleon's plan was a classic demonstration of divide and conquer. He would not wait in France for the Seventh Coalition to descend. Instead, he would march into Belgium, the territory of the United Netherlands, where the Anglo-Allied army under the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian army under Marshal Blücher had begun assembling. Their junction was inevitable, but not yet complete. If he could strike the hinge between them, he could crush each force in turn before they had time to consolidate. It was a bold gamble, but it played directly into his strength, maneuver warfare and rapid concentration of force. On June 12th, the French army began its covert advance from the Sambre River toward Charleroi, crossing the frontier before dawn on June 15th. The movement was lightning fast. As the French columns pushed northward, they encountered minimal resistance. Belgian towns like Beaumont, Philippeville, and Marchiennes-au-Pont were quickly secured. The element of surprise held, for now. In Charleroi, Napoleon stood at the head of his army, watching French flags rise above captured walls. He had caught the Allies off guard. Neither Wellington nor Blücher had expected an offensive so soon, or so directly. Intelligence reports had been vague, and the Allied command structure, split by language, politics, and distance, was sluggish to respond. That night, Napoleon issued a series of orders to begin the separation of the Anglo-Allied and Prussian armies. Marshal Ney was given command of the French left wing and ordered to push toward Quatre-Bras to block Wellington. Meanwhile, Napoleon himself would strike at the Prussians near Ligny with his main force. Marshal Grouchy, commanding the right wing, would protect the French flank and be prepared to pursue the Prussians if they retreated. This three-pronged assault reflected the Emperor's genius. He intended to create a wedge between his enemies, severing their communication and mutual support. If successful, he could destroy one army before the other intervened. It was a race against time. Every hour would count. On June 16th, the first major clashes erupted. At Quatre-Bras, Ney encountered unexpected resistance. Though initially only lightly defended, Wellington had quickly dispatched reinforcements. The Duke had moved with uncharacteristic speed after receiving word of the French advance. Ney, known for his impetuous bravery but not for calculated patience, launched repeated attacks. The battle raged throughout the day. Ney failed to take the crossroads, and the Anglo-Allied forces held the position. It was a costly delay in Napoleon's overall plan. Meanwhile, just 10 miles east, at Ligny, Napoleon personally led the assault on the Prussians. It was the Emperor's last battlefield victory. Facing Marshal Blücher's 84,000 men, Napoleon launched a fierce and calculated attack. French artillery pounded the Prussian lines while infantry columns drove into the villages. The Prussians resisted stubbornly, but by late evening, they began to falter. A devastating blow came when the French Imperial Guard, Napoleon's elite reserve, was unleashed. The Prussians broke. Blücher himself was injured when his horse was shot out from under him, trampled by fleeing soldiers. Yet his army was not annihilated. In the confusion, they retreated not eastward, back toward their supply lines, but northward, toward Wellington's position at Mont Saint-Jean. Napoleon, believing them beaten and in full retreat, ordered Marshal Grouchy to pursue and prevent their reformation. But the fog of war would soon thicken. Grouchy's pursuit lacked urgency. Communications broke down. The Prussians were bruised, but not broken, and they were far from finished. That evening, Napoleon received reports of Ney's failure to seize Quatre-Bras. The Anglo-Allied army had held, though with heavy losses. Now, instead of separating his enemies, both Wellington and Blücher remained within marching distance of one another. The window was closing. Still, Napoleon had struck first, and struck hard. He had forced the Allies onto the defensive. His army, though exhausted, still held the initiative. He now faced a crucial decision: whether to wait for Grouchy's confirmation of Prussian retreat or push forward to engage Wellington before the British and Prussians could reunite. He chose the latter. On the morning of June 17th, under stormy skies and with the roads turned to mud, Napoleon ordered the army to march toward Mont Saint-Jean, near the small village of Waterloo. Wellington had chosen his ground well, establishing a strong defensive line across a ridge south of the village. Blucher's battered army, though distant, was already reorganizing and marching to support him. Napoleon believed he could defeat the British before the Prussians arrived. One final battle could change everything. He had rolled the dice and won at Ligny. Now he would stake everything, his empire, his future, his name, on one more victory. The fields of Waterloo awaited. So too did destiny. As the storm clouds gathered over Belgium in mid-June 1815, two commanders stood between Napoleon Bonaparte and the resurrection of his empire. One was a seasoned British general, calm and calculating, respected across Europe for his discipline and coolness under fire. The other was a hardened Prussian field marshal, fiery and relentless, driven by revenge and resolve. Together, the Duke of Wellington and Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher would form the unlikely alliance that would determine the fate of Europe. Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, had never fought Napoleon directly before, but his reputation had long preceded him. Known as the Iron Duke, Wellington had earned fame and admiration for his campaigns against the French in the Peninsular War. His victories at Salamanca, Vittoria, and Toulouse had proven his brilliance in defensive warfare. Methodical, conservative, and politically astute, he commanded respect among the Allied leaders at the Congress of Vienna. When Napoleon escaped Elba, it was Wellington who was dispatched to lead the Anglo-Allied forces in the Low Countries. Wellington's command was diverse, and that diversity was a challenge. His army in Belgium included British regulars, Dutch Belgians, Hanoverians, and troops from Brunswick and Nassau, many of whom had limited combat experience or lingering sympathies for the French. Though he had around 68,000 men under arms, only a fraction were veterans. Wellington understood this well and chose his positions with extraordinary care, favoring defensible terrain and strong central positions. He knew he could not afford a mistake. Across the coalition lines stood Blücher, commander of the Prussian forces. At 72, he was old by battlefield standards, but no less dangerous. His hatred for Napoleon was deeply personal, rooted in years of humiliation following Prussian defeats at Jena and Auerstedt in 1806. Blücher had been among those who pushed hardest for Napoleon's exile. Now, with the French emperor returned, he saw his duty not only as military but moral. Blücher's personality was in stark contrast to Wellington's. Where the Iron Duke was measured and diplomatic, Blücher was aggressive and impulsive. He was known as Marshal Forwards, for his eagerness to attack. His Prussian troops, numbering around 120,000 across various corps, were better trained and more cohesive than Wellington's. However, they too had their weaknesses: poor roads, difficult terrain, and the need to coordinate with a foreign army operating under different doctrines and command structures. The alliance between Wellington and Blücher was far from seamless. Their languages, strategies, and military philosophies differed greatly. But they shared one vital objective: the destruction of Napoleon. Both knew that acting alone would be suicidal. Coordination, even if imperfect, was their only path to victory. On June 15th, as Napoleon launched his invasion of Belgium, Blücher's army was spread across a wide front. His headquarters were in Namur, while key corps were positioned near Sambref and Ligny. When the French advance became clear, Blücher moved quickly to concentrate his forces near Ligny to resist what he correctly suspected would be Napoleon's primary blow. Wellington, meanwhile, hurried to Quatre-Bras to stop Marshal Ney's advance and protect the road to Brussels. Though neither general had enough time to fully consolidate, they acted with remarkable speed. Messages were exchanged. Blücher assured Wellington that he would hold at Ligny and urged the British to stand firm at Quatre-Bras. Wellington promised to support Blücher if possible, but his forces were scattered and under immediate attack. On June 16, both generals found themselves under heavy pressure. Blücher suffered a serious defeat at Ligny, while Wellington narrowly held his ground at Quatre-Bras. Despite this, their alliance did not fracture. Instead, it endured, thanks in no small part to a shared understanding of what Napoleon's return meant. If they lost, Europe might plunge into another decade of war. Blücher, injured when his horse was shot and crushed him beneath its weight, was briefly incapacitated during the retreat from Ligny. His chief of staff, August Neidhart von Gneisenau, took temporary command and made a fateful decision. Instead of retreating east toward Prussia, he directed the army north toward Wavre. This kept the Prussians within supporting distance of Wellington, maintaining the critical possibility of a reunion. On June 17, as Napoleon pursued Wellington toward Mont Saint-Jean, Blücher's army regrouped. Despite their losses and exhaustion, the Prussians displayed extraordinary resilience. Gneisenau sent word to Wellington that Blücher would rejoin him as soon as possible. It was a promise born not of strategy alone, but of shared conviction. Wellington, in turn, selected a ridge just south of the village of Waterloo for his defensive stand. The ground was ideal, a gently sloping rise that allowed artillery to dominate the approaches. On either side of the road stood fortified farms, Hougoumont to the west and La Haye-Saint near the center, both of which would become critical strongpoints in the battle to come. By nightfall on June 17, both Wellington and Blücher had made their final preparations. Their communication was limited, their coordination imperfect, but their resolve was complete. They had no illusions about what faced them. Napoleon, once the master of Europe, was marching to destroy them before they could unite. If he succeeded, the world they fought to preserve would collapse. Rain poured over the countryside. Soldiers huddled in the mud, their uniforms soaked and their spirits uneasy. But in the tents of the generals, maps were laid out, and final orders were issued. The coming day would determine everything. Two men, so different in temperament and origin, were now bound together by purpose. Their armies, battered and incomplete, would have to stand as one. As dawn approached, Wellington and Blücher prepared to face their common enemy. Waterloo was no longer a village. It was the crucible of an age. In the days leading up to the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon Bonaparte stood once more at the head of a French army. It was not the same grand army that had thundered across Europe in the years of his imperial zenith, but it was the best he could muster, and it would have to be enough. As he prepared to strike the combined forces of Britain and Prussia, Napoleon entrusted the fate of his reclaimed empire to this army of 125,000 men, his final force. The army was a mirror of France in 1815, scarred, defiant, uncertain. After his return from Elba, Napoleon had moved with speed and urgency to rebuild his military strength. In just under 3 months, he had resurrected a professional fighting force from the shell of a demobilized nation. It was a remarkable feat, but not without flaws. While many of the officers and soldiers were veterans of earlier campaigns, others were conscripts, barely trained, armed in haste and dressed in uniforms scavenged from old stocks. Still, there was an energy in the ranks, a spirit born of loyalty and memory. Napoleon had once led these men to glory. Now, many believed he could do it again. The veterans, known as les grognards or the grumblers, had marched with him through Spain, Italy, Austria, and Russia. These were the core of the army's soul, hardened by years of battle and utterly devoted to the man they called the Emperor. The army was divided into several corps. At the center stood Napoleon himself, directing operations with characteristic precision. He was surrounded by a mix of experienced marshals and questionable appointments. Some of his old lieutenants were absent, dead, in exile, or reluctant to return. Others, like Marshal Michel Ney, returned with fierce enthusiasm, though their judgment would soon be tested. Ney, known as the bravest of the brave, was assigned command of the left wing. Though loyal and courageous, he was rash and unpredictable, traits that would cost the French dearly in the coming days. To the right, Napoleon placed Marshal Emmanuel de Grouchy, a cavalry commander of modest reputation, tasked with pursuing the Prussians after the Battle of Ligny. It was a critical responsibility, and Grouchy's performance would prove decisive and controversial. Marshal Jean de Soult, formerly a great field marshal in Spain, now served as Napoleon's chief of staff. Though capable, Soult struggled to fill the shoes of the late Marshal Berthier, whose logistical brilliance had been essential in past campaigns. The coordination of orders, movements, and intelligence was slower and less accurate than it had once been. The Imperial Guard, still the most prestigious unit in the army, remained a potent symbol of French power. Composed of elite infantry and cavalry, men handpicked for their loyalty and experience, the Guard was held in reserve, to be unleashed at the critical moment. Veterans in their 30s and 40s, some grizzled from a dozen campaigns, marched in step, polished and silent. They carried not just muskets and sabers, but the memory of empires. The rest of the army was composed of line infantry, light infantry, cavalry divisions, and artillery batteries. The infantry wore a patchwork of uniforms, many from earlier wars, and carried Charleville muskets, bayonets, and hopes of revival. Their training varied. Some had just weeks of drills before being sent north. Others were drawn from Napoleon's still loyal veterans who had returned to arms as soon as he landed at Golfe-Juan. The cavalry included cuirassiers and breastplates, dragoons, hussars, and lancers. Though once the terror of the battlefield, the cavalry's effectiveness had diminished after years of attrition. Horses were hard to replace, and many units lacked the numbers and cohesion of earlier campaigns. Still, their speed and shock value remained crucial to Napoleon's battlefield plans. The artillery, long the cornerstone of French dominance, was formidable but overstretched. Napoleon had always understood the value of concentrated firepower, using his batteries to shatter enemy lines before infantry closed the distance. Now, his guns were fewer, his caissons lighter, and his horses fewer in number. Yet in capable hands they still spoke with thunder. As the army advanced north from Charleroi, morale ran high. Ligny had shown them that the Emperor still had the touch. He had defeated Blücher, and many believed Wellington would soon follow. The soldiers marched through the rain and mud, the tricolor waving above them, drums echoing through villages. They sang old songs of glory, La victoire est à nous, and believed that history was turning in their favor. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were visible. The army lacked the coherence of past campaigns. Logistics were disorganized. Communication between units was inconsistent. And despite the Emperor's presence, riding among the men, inspecting their positions, addressing them directly, there was an awareness that this was a desperate campaign, one from which there might be no return. Napoleon himself sensed it. Though still brilliant, he was no longer the tireless commander of 1805. Years of war, exile, and illness had taken a toll. Some days he was energetic and commanding. Other days he appeared withdrawn, pained, distant. His reliance on subordinates like Ney and Grouchy, either of whom fully understood his intentions, would become a liability. Still, to the men of the Armée du Nord, he remained the Emperor. His very presence sparked belief. They would march for him. They would die for him. And in the green fields south of Brussels, they would fight for the dream of France restored. On the evening of June 17, 1815, the army reached the heights near Mont Saint-Jean. Rain poured from the sky. Mud churned beneath boots and wheels. Campfires flickered under soaked canvas. Across the ridge, the Anglo-Allied army was forming. Somewhere beyond, the battered Prussians were regrouping. Napoleon looked across the valley and saw his enemy. The final battle was hours away. On June 16, 1815, as storm clouds rolled across the plains of Belgium, Napoleon Bonaparte stood poised to strike the first decisive blow of his final campaign. The small village of Ligny, nestled among fields and low ridges, would become the setting for his last battlefield victory, a clash that demonstrated both his enduring brilliance and the cracks beginning to form in his command. The strategic stakes were immense. Napoleon had invaded Belgium with the intent of driving a wedge between the Anglo-Allied forces under the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian army led by Field Marshal Blücher. If he could defeat them in isolation, before they combined their strength, he might topple both and force a favorable peace. Time was against him. Each day brought the risk of their unification. By June 15th, the French had crossed the Sambre River and seized Charleroi. The next day, Napoleon moved swiftly to engage the Prussians near Sombreff, where Blücher had concentrated nearly 84,000 men. The field was anchored by the villages of Saint-Amand, Ligny, and Boigny, lying along a creek in marshy terrain. These villages would become the focal points of a brutal and bitter struggle. The French fielded around 68,000 men under Napoleon's direct command, including a strong contingent of cavalry and artillery. While outnumbered, the French had two major advantages: the element of surprise and the Emperor's presence. Napoleon had hoped to attack earlier in the day, but delays in coordinating with Marshal Ney, who was supposed to seize Quatre Bras to prevent Wellington from supporting Blücher, postponed the opening assault. By mid-afternoon, Napoleon resolved to begin without Ney's confirmation. He believed Wellington would be delayed or occupied and gambled on striking Blücher hard and fast. At 2:30 p.m., French guns opened fire. The Battle of Ligny had begun. Napoleon focused his initial attacks on Saint-Amand, believing it the key to unhinging the Prussian right. The fighting was savage. The French infantry surged forward under General Vandamme, engaging in house-to-house combat with Prussian defenders. Cannon roared across the fields, tearing into battalions packed along the narrow lanes. Prussian counterattacks poured in from reserves under General Perch and General Ziethen, determined to hold the ground. Meanwhile, Napoleon directed his center toward Ligny village, defended by fierce Prussian resistance. The terrain here was especially treacherous, choked with orchards, walls, and streams. The fighting descended into close-quarter chaos. Both sides poured in reinforcements, turning the village into a slaughterhouse. Soldiers clashed with bayonets in courtyards and alleys slick with rain and blood. Blücher, ever the aggressive commander, refused to fall back. At 72, he personally led cavalry charges, shouting orders with fire in his eyes. Though wounded when his horse was shot and collapsed on him, Blücher refused to leave the field. His staff pulled him free, battered but unbroken. His presence inspired his men, but the pressure was mounting. On the French side, Napoleon held his Imperial Guard in reserve, waiting for the decisive moment. For hours, he remained confident that Ney was engaging Wellington at Quatre Bras and preventing reinforcements from reaching Blücher. But unknown to him, Ney had failed to take the crossroads. Wellington, though delayed, remained in position to assist the Prussians, had the opportunity allowed. At around 7 p.m., as dusk approached, Napoleon identified a critical gap forming in the Prussian center. He ordered a devastating blow. The Imperial Guard, his most elite infantry and grenadiers, would break the enemy once and for all. With bayonets fixed and drums beating, the Guards surged forward, their tall bearskin hats and unwavering formation striking fear into all who saw them. The attack was overwhelming. Exhausted Prussian battalions crumbled under the assault. The line collapsed at the center, and Ligny fell. A wave of panic rippled through the Prussian rear as retreat began in earnest. Artillery was abandoned, dead and wounded left behind. For a moment, it seemed the French had secured total victory. But the triumph was incomplete. Marshal Grouchy, stationed on the right, had failed to prevent the escape of the Prussian forces. Moreover, in the chaotic twilight, Blücher's army retreated not eastward, as Napoleon had expected, but northward toward Wavre, closer to Wellington's position. Blücher and his chief of staff, Gneisenau, understood that their only hope lay in preserving the alliance and reuniting with the British. Napoleon, however, believed the Prussians were in disarray and retreating far from the theater of battle. He ordered Grouchy to pursue them and ensure they could not regroup. It was a reasonable directive, based on faulty assumptions. The fog of war had once again concealed critical truths. At the same time, news reached Napoleon that Ney had failed to capture Quatre Bras. Wellington's army had held its ground and remained within striking distance of the Prussians. The separation Napoleon sought between the two Allied forces had not been achieved. Still, the Battle of Ligny was a tactical victory. Napoleon had defeated one of his two great enemies in a head-on clash, inflicting over 16,000 casualties. The Prussians had been driven from the field, and their morale shaken. It was a reminder of the Emperor's prowess, a final echo of the victories at Austerlitz and Jena. Yet the cost was high, and the strategic situation was shifting beneath his feet. As darkness fell over Ligny, the fields were strewn with the dead. Fires burned in the shattered villages, casting long shadows over broken regiments. French troops tended their wounded and reloaded their muskets. Napoleon rode among them, calm and composed, certain that he had turned the tide. But the battle, though won, had not broken the coalition. Blücher had survived. His army had escaped. And in the coming days their return would shape the fate of Europe. Ahead lay Waterloo. On June 16, 1815, while Napoleon was delivering his last victory at Ligny, another critical battle unfolded just 10 miles west at the crossroads of Quatre Bras. Here, the fate of the Anglo-Allied army under the Duke of Wellington was put to the ultimate test. The stakes could not have been higher. If Marshal Ney succeeded in capturing Quatre Bras, Wellington's forces would be severed from their Prussian allies, dooming any chance of a combined defense. Conversely, holding the position was essential to maintain the alliance that might ultimately defeat Napoleon. The crossroads itself was a vital junction linking Brussels to Namur and Liège, the key avenues of movement in Belgium. Controlling Quatre Bras meant controlling access to the interior of the country. Wellington, recognizing this, had sent urgent orders to reinforce the position as soon as French movements suggested an offensive was underway. Though outnumbered and scattered, he understood that holding Quatre Bras was essential to stopping Napoleon's plan. Marshal Ney, commanding the French left wing, was ordered to seize Quatre Bras. Ney was famed for his courage and aggressive tactics, though he sometimes acted without full coordination. He advanced with roughly 30,000 men, aiming to crush the Allied defenders quickly before they could reinforce or retreat. On the morning of June 16, Ney's forces arrived at Quatre Bras. The crossroads was defended by approximately 17,000 troops, British, Dutch, Belgian, and German contingents, under the command of the Prince of Orange and British General Sir Thomas Picton. Many of these troops were inexperienced and wary of the French, but they fought with determination, bolstered by Wellington's orders to hold at all costs. The battle began with a fierce artillery exchange, French guns firing from wooded heights. Infantry skirmishes quickly escalated into brutal hand-to-hand combat among the farms, hedgerows, and rolling fields. Ney launched repeated assaults on the Allied lines, attempting to break their center and flanks. The fighting was chaotic and confused, marked by shifting control of strategic points such as the farm of La Belle Alliance and the wood of Bossu. Despite Ney's relentless attacks, the defenders held firm. Wellington, receiving reports of the battle, moved troops swiftly from other positions to reinforce Quatre Bras, including experienced units under the command of the Earl of Uxbridge and the King's German Legion. The steady arrival of reinforcements bolstered morale and stiffened resistance. Ney's assaults were costly and inconclusive. French troops suffered heavy casualties as they attempted to breach well-prepared positions. Coordination among French units was imperfect, exacerbated by muddy terrain and miscommunication. The French cavalry charges, once so feared, met stiff resistance from British infantry squares, disciplined and resolute. As evening approached, the battle remained undecided. Neither side could claim a clear victory, but the strategic importance of holding Quatre Bras was realized by the Allies. The position had not fallen to Ney, and Wellington's forces remained intact and ready for the next phase. Critically, this meant that Wellington's army could still link with the Prussians. Though Blücher had been defeated at Ligny and was in retreat, his army was moving northward, not east as Napoleon had anticipated. Wellington was aware of this movement, and understood that the coming battle would be a joint effort. Meanwhile, Marshal Grouchy, tasked by Napoleon with pursuing the retreating Prussians, was too far east to influence the battle at Quatre Bras. His delayed pursuit allowed Blücher to regroup and march to Wellington's aid, an opportunity that would prove decisive. The night of June 16th was a tense one. Both sides regrouped, tended to the wounded, and prepared for the confrontation looming on the horizon, the Battle of Waterloo. Wellington chose his defensive ground carefully, positioning his troops along a ridge near the village of Mont Saint-Jean, south of Waterloo. This ridge offered natural advantages, gentle slopes favoring defense, commanding views of the French approach, and strong points at farms such as Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte. Wellington's army, a mixed force of British, Dutch, Belgian, German, and Allied soldiers, was weary but determined. He knew that the battle to come would be the greatest challenge of his career. Yet his troops trusted their commander's judgment, fortified their positions, and steeled themselves for the storm ahead. As dawn broke on June 17, 1815, the armies faced each other across the muddy fields. Rain had turned the ground into a quagmire, hindering movement and dulling weapons. The stage was set for a titanic struggle, a battle that would decide not only the fate of Napoleon but the future of Europe. Wellington, calm and resolute, awaited the enemy's assault. He knew time was his ally, hoping that Blücher's Prussians would arrive before the day's end to tip the balance. Napoleon, confident after Ligny, believed he could defeat Wellington before Prussian reinforcements arrived. But the battle for Quatre Bras had delayed his plans, costing precious hours. The Allies were not so easily broken. The first shots of Waterloo were moments away. As the sun dipped below the horizon on June 17, 1815, the weary armies of Europe faced a fragile pause in the heart of Belgium. The fields near Waterloo lay drenched from days of relentless rain, the mud thick and clinging to boots, wheels, and weapons. Soldiers huddled in tents, farmhouses, and makeshift shelters, preparing for what would become the most decisive battle of their era. It was a night heavy with tension, uncertainty, and the quiet before the storm. For Napoleon Bonaparte, the night was a moment of reflection and strategy. His army had marched hard and fast to reach this point, striking a blow against the Prussians at Ligny and pressing Wellington's forces at Quatre Bras. But the unexpected resilience of his enemies had frustrated his plans. Ney's failure to capture the vital crossroads had delayed the French offensive, allowing the Anglo-Allied army to hold firm and maintain contact with the Prussians. It was a setback that weighed heavily on the Emperor's mind. Napoleon was not a man to dwell on setbacks for long. In his command tent, maps were spread out beneath flickering candlelight, and his generals gathered around. Marshal Soult, his chief of staff, and Marshal Ney exchanged reports. Grouchy, pursuing the Prussians with a sizable force, was too distant to influence the immediate battle. The Emperor's hope now rested on striking Wellington before Blucher's army could arrive to reinforce. Orders were issued for a dawn assault on the ridge near Mont Saint-Jean. The plan called for a coordinated attack, artillery bombardment to soften enemy positions, followed by infantry assaults on key strongpoints, with cavalry poised to exploit any breakthrough. Napoleon believed in the strength of his troops and the precision of his tactics. Victory, he was certain, was within reach. Yet beneath Napoleon's confidence, cracks in communication and morale surfaced. Some commanders, notably Ney, were eager to press attacks quickly, risking premature engagements. Others cautioned patience. The heavy rains had turned the fields into a muddy quagmire, complicating maneuvers and artillery deployment. Supply lines were strained after weeks of rapid campaigning. Across the battlefield, the Duke of Wellington maintained his characteristic calm. His headquarters were set in a farmhouse near the village of Waterloo. He knew the French army was formidable, but he trusted the defensibility of his chosen ground. His troops were entrenched along a ridge that gave them a commanding view of the approaches. The farmhouses of Hougoumont, La Haye-Sainte, and Papiermont were fortified with earthworks and garrisoned by determined defenders. Wellington spent the evening coordinating with his subordinates, distributing rations, inspecting lines, and planning reserves. His army was a patchwork of nationalities. British, Dutch, Belgian, German, and Hanoverian troops formed a mosaic united by a common cause. Some were veterans hardened by years of war. Others were newly conscripted and anxious. All understood the gravity of the moment. The night air was heavy with anticipation. Soldiers talked quietly among themselves, sharing memories and fears. Drums and bugles were silent, replaced by the sounds of whispered prayers and the occasional clink of musket repairs. Despite exhaustion, there was a sense of steely resolve, a knowledge that history awaited them at first light. Further east, Marshal Blucher's Prussian army encamped near Wavre, recovering from their defeat at Ligny but refusing to concede. Blucher, despite injuries sustained in battle, remained determined. His chief of staff, General Gneisenau, urged rapid movement to support Wellington. Orders were dispatched to prepare for a forced march toward the battlefield, aiming to arrive before the French could finish their assault. The coordination between Wellington and Blucher was imperfect but crucial. Messages passed between commanders emphasized the need for mutual support. The alliance, though forged by necessity rather than friendship, was held together by the understanding that victory depended on standing together. As night deepened, the rain began to fall once more. The muddy fields promised a difficult fight at dawn. Artillery pieces sank into the soil, horses struggled to find footing, and infantrymen soaked by the weather steeled themselves for the coming battle. In his tent, Napoleon reflected on the road that had brought him here. From exile on Elba to the thunder of battlefields once more, he had gambled everything on this moment. The coming hours would determine not only the fate of France but the future of Europe. Across the ridge, Wellington gazed toward the dark horizon, awaiting the enemy's advance. The fate of nations balanced on a knife's edge. The storm was about to break. As dawn broke on June 18, 1815, the rain that had drenched the fields near Waterloo began to ease, revealing a landscape marred by mud, churned earth, and the faint mist of early morning fog. The stage was set for one of history's most consequential battles. The French army, under Napoleon Bonaparte, prepared to launch its offensive against the entrenched Anglo-Allied forces commanded by the Duke of Wellington. Napoleon's plan called for a massive artillery bombardment to weaken Wellington's positions, followed by coordinated infantry attacks aiming to break through the defensive lines. The objective was clear: shatter the enemy's cohesion before Prussian reinforcements could arrive. Time was pressing, and the Emperor knew every hour counted. At approximately 11:30 a.m., French batteries opened fire along the ridge. Over 150 guns unleashed a devastating barrage aimed primarily at the Allied center and the fortified farms of Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte. The thunder of cannon fire rolled across the battlefield, shaking earth and shattering trees. The French artillerymen, seasoned veterans, worked with practiced efficiency, shifting their fire to counter any movements. The Allies responded in kind. Wellington's own artillery, though fewer in number, was expertly positioned and fiercely defended. British gunners returned fire, aiming to disrupt the French advance and protect key defensive points. The crests of hills echoed with explosions, and the air was thick with smoke and the acrid scent of gunpowder. Amid the chaos, infantry units began to advance. French grenadiers and voltigas moved forward, seeking to probe the Allied lines. Initial skirmishes erupted near the farm of Hougoumont, a large estate fortified by British guards and other units. French forces launched repeated assaults on the farm, hoping to capture this strategic stronghold and use it as a springboard for further attacks. Hougoumont became the focus of fierce and bloody combat. The defenders, under the command of Colonel MacDonell, held resolutely against waves of French infantry and cavalry. The farm's thick walls and barricaded gates absorbed repeated charges. For hours, the fighting was brutal and personal, hand-to-hand clashes in courtyards and buildings, desperate bayonet fights in narrow lanes. Hougoumont would remain a linchpin throughout the battle, its defense buying crucial time for Wellington's army. Elsewhere along the line, French troops pushed toward La Haye-Sainte, another fortified farmhouse near the center. This position was held by the King's German Legion, soldiers known for discipline and resilience. French artillery and infantry assaults battered the farm's defenses throughout the afternoon. Despite intense pressure, the defenders held firm, though the farm eventually fell late in the day after fierce fighting. Napoleon, observing from a nearby ridge, remained confident. His infantry attacks, supported by cavalry charges, aimed to break the Allied center and roll up the line. However, Wellington's defensive arrangements, combined with the muddy terrain, made swift movement difficult for the French. The rain had softened the ground, hindering cavalry charges and artillery deployment. Marshal Ney, commanding the French left wing, launched repeated cavalry assaults against Wellington's infantry squares, formations designed to repel mounted attacks. The British infantry held their ground, repelling charge after charge despite heavy casualties. Ney's charges, though brave, were ultimately unsuccessful in breaking the Allied lines. Meanwhile, the French cavalry under Marshal Kellerman swept along the flanks, attempting to exploit any openings. These mounted troops clashed with Allied cavalry units and infantry, creating pockets of fierce fighting across the field. But Wellington's troops maintained their cohesion, repelling attacks with disciplined musket volleys. Throughout the afternoon, the battle ebbed and flowed. French assaults were met with stubborn resistance. The Allies, though pressed, refused to yield ground. Commanders on both sides faced challenges in communication and coordination amid the smoke and noise. Reports and orders were delayed or misinterpreted. The fog of war clouded decisions. Yet, the most critical factor was the absence of the Prussian army. Blücher's forces, battered but not broken, were marching to the battlefield. Though late, their approach would soon change the course of the fight. As the sun lowered toward evening, the intensity of the French attacks began to wane. Exhausted soldiers grappled with mud, wounds, and fatigue. The Allied line held, but the cost was high, casualties mounted, and the threat of breakthrough remained. Napoleon prepared for a final, decisive assault. He ordered the Imperial Guard, his elite veterans, to be readied. This reserve force had never been defeated in battle and was the symbol of French military might. If the Guard could break the Allied center, victory would be assured. The fate of Europe rested on what would come next. As evening approached on June 18, 1815, the thunderous cannonade and fierce infantry fighting near the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean had raged for hours, with either side gaining a decisive advantage. Napoleon Bonaparte, recognizing that the French attacks had been blunted, prepared to commit his last and most feared reserve, the Imperial Guard, an elite force composed of battle-hardened veterans who had been his steadfast supporters through the years of conquest and defeat. The Imperial Guard was more than just a military unit, it was a symbol of the French Empire's glory and resilience. Composed of veteran grenadiers and chasseurs, these men were the Emperor's personal guard and the core of his strategic strength. Their reputation was legendary. They had never broken in battle, and their presence on the field often turned the tide of engagements. Now, in the dying hours of this epic struggle, Napoleon placed his final hope in their shoulders. The Guard was held in reserve for most of the day, watching the brutal and costly French assaults unfold without breaking the Allied lines. Their late commitment was intended to deliver a knockout blow, shattering Wellington's center and forcing a collapse of the coalition forces. Confidence in the Imperial Guard was high. Many believed that once unleashed, no enemy could stand against them. At around 7 p.m., as twilight descended and exhaustion began to weigh heavily on all soldiers, Napoleon ordered the Guard forward. Columns of proud veterans moved out from their sheltered positions on the ridge, their steady step and unyielding discipline a stark contrast to the battered French units already engaged. The men marched with a quiet determination, fully aware of the burden resting on their shoulders. Facing them stood the steadfast British and Allied troops, exhausted but resolute, their infantry squares braced against any attack. Wellington himself observed from a vantage point, understanding the gravity of what was to come. The Imperial Guard was a force to be feared, but he trusted in his men and the approaching arrival of the Prussians. The French columns advanced steadily across the muddy fields, musket volleys and artillery fire falling around them. The Guard's steady pace and tight formation earned the admiration of even their enemies. As they closed in on the Allied center near the farm of La Belle Alliance, they faced fierce resistance. Wellington's infantry fired disciplined volleys into the advancing Guard. Despite the hail of musket balls and cannon shot, the Imperial Guard pushed on. The fighting was intense and close, with French and Allied soldiers exchanging blows amid shattered fences and churned earth. The tide of battle seemed to teeter on a knife's edge. However, as the Guard pressed their attack, unexpected developments shifted the battlefield dramatically. The distant sound of cannon fire and the rumble of marching feet signaled the arrival of Marshal Blucher's Prussian army. After a grueling forced march from Wavre, the Prussians began to pour onto the French right flank and rear, threatening to envelop Napoleon's forces. The arrival of the Prussians was the turning point. French units, already stretched and exhausted, struggled to redeploy and meet this new threat. Panic began to ripple through the ranks. The Imperial Guard, sensing the growing danger and facing sustained Allied fire, began to falter. In what would become one of history's most dramatic moments, the elite Guard, once invincible, was forced to retreat. The sight of the retreat shocked French troops and officers alike. The myth of the Guard's invincibility shattered in the face of overwhelming pressure and coordinated Allied and Prussian resistance. As the Guard withdrew, Wellington ordered his troops to advance. The battered French lines began to crumble under the combined assault of British infantry and Prussian forces. The French army, which had marched with such hope and confidence hours before, now began a disorderly retreat. Napoleon, realizing the battle was lost, withdrew to regroup. The Grande Armée, once the mightiest force in Europe, was broken. The fields near Waterloo were strewn with the dead and dying, the echoes of muskets and cannon fading into the night. The defeat at Waterloo marked the end of Napoleon's rule and the beginning of a new era in European history. The courage of the soldiers on both sides, the leadership of commanders like Wellington and Blücher, and the sheer scale of the conflict ensured that this battle would be remembered for centuries. The sun rose slowly on June 19, 1815, casting a pale light over the shattered fields of Waterloo. The battle was over, but its impact would echo across Europe for decades to come. The defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte by the combined forces of the Duke of Wellington and Field Marshal Blücher marked not only the end of a war but the beginning of a profound transformation in the continent's political landscape. In the immediate aftermath, the battlefield was a scene of devastation. Thousands of soldiers from both sides lay dead or wounded amid the churned mud and broken fences. The cries of the wounded and the grim tasks of burying the dead filled the air. The Allied armies, exhausted but victorious, began to regroup and secure the area. Napoleon had fled the battlefield, retreating with what remained of his forces toward France. His once great army was in disarray, many units scattered, morale shattered. The loss at Waterloo was a final blow to the ambitions that had driven the emperor for over a decade. Within days, Napoleon abdicated for the second time, surrendering to the British and agreeing to exile on the remote island of St. Helena. This marked the definitive end of his rule and the Napoleonic Wars that had convulsed Europe since 1803. The victory at Waterloo was more than a military triumph. It was a turning point in European history. The Congress of Vienna, convened during Napoleon's first exile, had sought to restore stability and balance to the continent. Waterloo confirmed the success of those efforts and ensured the restoration of monarchies and established borders. Under the guidance of the victorious powers, Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, the post-war settlement aimed to prevent the rise of another empire like Napoleon's. A system of alliances and diplomatic congresses, known as the Concert of Europe, was established to maintain peace and resolve conflicts through negotiation rather than war. Wellington and Blücher emerged as heroes, celebrated not only for their battlefield prowess but for their roles in preserving European stability. Wellington returned to Britain to great acclaim, eventually serving as Prime Minister, while Blücher was honored as a symbol of Prussian resilience and patriotism. The social and political effects of the Napoleonic Wars were far-reaching. The ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, had spread across Europe, inspiring nationalist and liberal movements. Though suppressed in many areas by the conservative order restored at Vienna, these ideas would continue to influence the continent throughout the 19th century. The military innovations and lessons learned during the Napoleonic era shaped warfare for generations. The importance of mass conscription, coordinated corps maneuvers, and combined arms tactics became standard in armies worldwide. Waterloo itself became a symbol of both the end of an era and the resilience of Europe's nations. The battlefield was preserved, monuments erected, and the story told and retold in countless books, paintings, and songs. It became a reminder of the costs of war and the fragile nature of peace. In the broader context, the defeat of Napoleon paved the way for a century of relative peace among Europe's great powers, known as the Pax Britannica. Britain's naval supremacy and the alliance system maintained a balance that prevented large-scale continental wars until the outbreak of World War I nearly a century later. Thus, the Battle of Waterloo was not merely a clash of armies. It was the fulcrum on which the future of Europe pivoted. The courage and sacrifice of thousands, the strategies of brilliant commanders, and the currents of history converged in those muddy fields to shape the modern world. The Battle of Waterloo, fought on June 18, 1815, left an indelible mark on history, not only as a decisive military engagement but as a cultural and symbolic event that shaped the collective memory of Europe and the world. In the years and centuries that followed, the battle transcended its immediate military significance to become a powerful emblem of victory, loss, and the complex forces that define history. In the immediate aftermath, the battlefield itself became a place of somber reflection. The scale of casualties, estimated at over 50,000 dead and wounded on both sides, was staggering. Villagers, soldiers, and visitors grappled with the horror and human cost of the fight. Early efforts to bury the dead and mark the field began soon after the guns fell silent, but the landscape remained scarred for decades. Monuments and memorials were erected to honor the fallen. Among the most notable was the Lion's Mound, constructed by the Belgian government in the 1820s on the site of a key part of the battle. This giant artificial hill, topped by a statue of a lion, stands as a symbol of courage and vigilance, visible for miles around. Nearby, numerous smaller memorials mark the positions of various units and commanders, telling the story of the battle in stone and bronze. The memory of Waterloo entered popular culture almost immediately. Artists such as Benjamin West and William Sadler immortalized scenes of the battle in dramatic paintings. Writers and poets composed works inspired by the courage and tragedy of the day. The phrase, "meeting one's Waterloo," entered common speech as a metaphor for facing an insurmountable defeat or challenge. In Britain, the Duke of Wellington was hailed as the nation's greatest military hero, celebrated in statues, ceremonies, and even in the naming of streets and institutions. Similarly, Field Marshal Blücher was revered in Prussia and later Germany as a symbol of steadfastness and national pride. However, the legacy of Waterloo was not without controversy or complexity. In France, the battle was a bitter wound. It marked the end of Napoleon's reign and the collapse of the revolutionary and imperial ideals that many Frenchmen still cherished. The memory of Waterloo fueled debates about France's national identity, its military traditions, and its role in Europe. Historians and scholars have since explored the battle from multiple perspectives: military, political, social, and cultural, seeking to understand the myriad factors that led to the French defeat and its consequences. The battle is studied not just as a tactical engagement but as a turning point in European history, reflecting broader themes of power, nationalism, and the limits of ambition. Waterloo also influenced military doctrine and training for generations. Its lessons on coalition warfare, battlefield communication, and the effective use of reserves informed the strategies of armies around the world. Commanders from Napoleon to modern generals have analyzed the battle's successes and failures. Commemorations of Waterloo continue to this day. Every 5 years, reenactments and ceremonies bring together history enthusiasts, descendants of soldiers, and tourists from across the globe. These events foster reflection on the human cost of war and the enduring importance of peace. The battlefield itself has been preserved as a historical site and museum complex, offering visitors immersive experiences that connect them to the past. Through exhibits, guided tours, and educational programs, the story of Waterloo is passed down to new generations. In literature and media, Waterloo remains a rich source of inspiration. Films, novels, and documentaries revisit the events with fresh interpretations, ensuring the battle's place in the public imagination. Its lessons about leadership, courage, and consequence resonate beyond the military sphere, touching on universal aspects of human experience. Ultimately, the memory of Waterloo reminds us that history is not just about dates and armies but about people, their hopes, fears, and choices. It challenges us to remember the costs of conflict and to seek paths toward reconciliation and understanding. As Europe moved into a new era of relative peace after Waterloo, the battle's legacy served as both a warning and a guidepost. It underscored the power of alliances, the importance of unity, and the fragile nature of power itself. Waterloo endures not only in textbooks and monuments, but in the hearts and minds of those who recognize that history's great moments shaped the world we live in today. The Battle of Waterloo was more than a clash of armies. It was a critical moment in the evolution of military technology and tactics. As the Napoleonic Wars drew to a close, the battlefield revealed how innovations in weaponry, battlefield communication, and troop organization influenced the outcome and foreshadowed changes that would shape warfare in the 19th century. At the heart of Waterloo's tactical landscape was the use of artillery, a cornerstone of Napoleonic warfare. Both the French and Allied forces deployed hundreds of cannons and howitzers, which played a decisive role in softening enemy positions and supporting infantry assaults. Napoleon himself was a former artillery officer and understood the devastating potential of massed firepower. French artillery batteries opened the battle with an intense bombardment designed to break Wellington's lines before infantry and cavalry moved in. Though powerful, the rain-soaked ground hampered the effectiveness of some artillery pieces, slowing their deployment and muddying the impact of cannonballs. Meanwhile, Allied artillery responded with accuracy and resilience, aided by skilled gunners who adapted to the difficult conditions. The musket, the primary infantry weapon, was a smooth-bore flintlock firing lead balls approximately once every 15 to 20 seconds in trained hands. Both sides relied heavily on disciplined volleys fired in close ranks. The British infantry's famous square formations were especially effective against cavalry charges, presenting a bristling wall of bayonets on all sides. Cavalry units played a dual role, used for reconnaissance, and rapid charges intended to disrupt enemy formations. French cavalry, including cuirassiers and lancers, launched several assaults during the battle. However, the muddy terrain and steadfast infantry squares blunted their impact, illustrating the limitations of cavalry in such conditions. One of the key tactical elements was the defensive use of terrain. Wellington's choice of the ridge near Mont Saint-Jean was strategic. The elevated ground offered natural defensive advantages, forcing French attackers to advance uphill under fire. Key strongpoints such as the farms of Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte were fortified and garrisoned, creating focal points that absorbed French attacks and delayed their advance. Coordination among Allied units was crucial. Wellington's command style emphasized flexibility and the use of combined arms, integrating infantry, cavalry, and artillery to respond dynamically to French assaults. However, communication challenges persisted, as orders had to be relayed by messengers across a chaotic battlefield. Napoleon's tactics focused on rapid, decisive attacks to fracture the enemy before they could effectively respond. His use of corps-level organization allowed semi-independent movements of large forces, providing operational flexibility. Yet at Waterloo, imperfect coordination among his marshals, including Ney's delayed attacks and Grouchy's failure to prevent the Prussian arrival, hindered execution. The presence and timely arrival of the Prussian army under Blücher was a critical tactical factor. Their intervention on the French flank forced Napoleon to divide his forces and eventually contributed to the collapse of French resistance. Additionally, logistical considerations played a role. Supplying tens of thousands of troops with food, ammunition, and equipment in the wet terrain was a constant challenge. Both sides grappled with the difficulties of movement, communication, and maintaining morale under adverse weather. Waterloo showcased the transition between older Napoleonic-era warfare and emerging 19th-century military concepts. While muskets and cannon remained dominant, the battle hinted at future changes. Rifled weapons, improved artillery accuracy, and more sophisticated command and control systems would soon transform battlefields. In summary, the Battle of Waterloo demonstrated the critical interplay of technology, terrain, and tactics. It underscored the importance of leadership and coordination and revealed both the strengths and limitations of the military tools of the era. These lessons informed military thought for decades and remain a subject of study for historians and strategists worldwide. The Battle of Waterloo stands as one of history's most studied conflicts, not only for its scale and impact but also for the critical leadership and command decisions that shaped its outcome. The actions, choices, and personalities of key commanders, Napoleon Bonaparte, the Duke of Wellington, and Field Marshal Blücher, defined the battle's ebb and flow and ultimately determined the fate of Europe. Napoleon, the French emperor, was renowned for his strategic brilliance and aggressive tactics. His leadership style combined boldness with meticulous planning. However, at Waterloo, several factors challenged his command. Delays in coordination, particularly between his marshals Ney and Grouchy, disrupted the timing of attacks. Ney's premature cavalry charges without adequate infantry support, and Grouchy's failure to prevent the Prussians from joining Wellington critically weakened the French position. Despite these setbacks, Napoleon maintained control and adapted as the battle unfolded. He reserved his elite Imperial Guard for the final assault, confident their strength could break Allied resistance. Yet, the Emperor's inability to effectively manage subordinate commanders in the chaos of battle proved costly. His strategic vision was clear, but execution faltered. The Duke of Wellington, commander of the Anglo-Allied forces, contrasted sharply with Napoleon's flamboyant style. Known for his cautious and pragmatic approach, Wellington excelled at defensive warfare and coalition management. His selection of the Mont Saint-Jean Ridge as a defensive position showcased his understanding of terrain's importance. Wellington's leadership emphasized discipline, coordination, and morale. He trusted his troops' resilience, organizing them in squares and fortifying key points such as Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte. His calm demeanor under pressure inspired confidence among officers and soldiers alike. Critically, Wellington maintained communication and cooperation with Blücher's Prussian forces. Their alliance, though not without tension, was essential. Wellington's ability to hold at Quatre Bras prevented the French from isolating him, allowing the two armies to converge at Waterloo. Field Marshal Blücher's leadership was characterized by tenacity and courage. Despite being wounded at Ligny, he insisted on accompanying his troops and pushed for rapid movement to support Wellington. His decisive arrival on the battlefield's flank was instrumental in turning the tide against Napoleon. Blücher's aggressive pursuit of the French contrasted with Wellington's defensive strategy, creating a complementary dynamic between the two commanders. Their coordination exemplified the power of coalition warfare when unified by a common goal. Communication challenges abounded throughout the battle. Messages were often delayed or misunderstood amid the noise and confusion. The reliance on couriers and signal systems underscored the limitations of early 19th century command and control. Individual leadership decisions also influenced moments within the battle. For example, Colonel Macdonell's staunch defense of Hougoumont delayed French progress, while General Picton's leadership at La Haye-Sainte sustained critical positions despite overwhelming pressure. In contrast, some French commanders struggled under pressure or made tactical errors. Marshal Ney's impatience led to costly cavalry charges, and Marshal Grouchy's delayed response to the Prussian movements diminished the effectiveness of French pursuit. Ultimately, the Battle of Waterloo demonstrated that leadership in warfare extends beyond strategy to include adaptability, coordination, and morale. The ability of commanders to inspire troops, manage alliances, and make timely decisions amid chaos proved decisive. The battle serves as a timeless study in command, highlighting the complex interplay between individual genius and collective effort. It reminds us that even the greatest leaders are tested by the unpredictability of war, and that victory often hinges on the strength of unity and resilience. The Battle of Waterloo not only marked the final defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte, but also ushered in a profound transformation in the political, social, and diplomatic order of Europe. With Napoleon's ambitions extinguished, the continent entered a new era defined by efforts to preserve peace, restore stability, and manage the rising tides of nationalism and liberalism. In the immediate wake of Waterloo, the victorious Allied powers, Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, convened to shape the post-Napoleonic world. The Congress of Vienna, which had met intermittently since 1814, accelerated its work to redraw borders, restore monarchies, and establish a balance of power that would prevent future continental domination by any one state. The settlement reaffirmed the principle of legitimacy, restoring thrones to rulers displaced by Napoleon's conquests. France was returned to its 1792 borders but retained as a significant European power to maintain equilibrium. The map of Europe was altered with new kingdoms, duchies, and alliances designed to create buffers and prevent aggressive expansion. The concert of Europe emerged as a diplomatic system aimed at collective security and conflict resolution through negotiation rather than war. This unprecedented cooperation among great powers sought to maintain the fragile peace and manage revolutionary movements that threatened the established order. Domestically, the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars spurred social and political changes. The ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, had spread far beyond France, igniting nationalist and liberal sentiments across Europe. While many regimes sought to suppress these ideas, their influence persisted, setting the stage for future upheavals and reforms. Military doctrines evolved, incorporating lessons from the Napoleonic campaigns and the Battle of Waterloo. Nations modernized their armies, emphasizing professional standing forces, improved training, and more sophisticated command structures. The age of mass conscription and total war had begun, reshaping the nature of conflict. Culturally, the memory of Waterloo influenced literature, art, and national identity. The battle became a symbol of both heroic sacrifice and the costs of empire. It inspired generations to reflect on leadership, strategy, and the human experience of war. Politically, Europe entered a period of relative stability known as the Pax Britannica, with Britain's naval supremacy and diplomatic influence maintaining order. This peace lasted until the outbreak of World War I nearly a century later. Waterloo's legacy thus marks the closing of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic era and the dawn of a modern European system. It represents the triumph of collective action over individual ambition and the complex balance between war and peace. As the 19th century unfolded, the ideals and tensions born in this period would continue to shape the continent's destiny. The battle's lessons endure, reminders of the fragility of power, the importance of unity, and the enduring quest for peace. The fields of Waterloo remain a testament to a pivotal moment when history turned, shaping the Europe we know today.